Be'ezrat Hashem, we begin today a new set of laws, second set in this fourth book of the Rambam, Hilchos Geirushin, the laws of divorce. As the Rambam always does, he tells us which mitzvahs we're going to be discussing in this set of laws. Yesh bichlolon shtei mitzvahs. Included in these laws are two commandments. Achas mitzvah saseh, one is a positive commandment. V'hi sheyigaresh hamegaresh b'sefer. That is, that if somebody wants to divorce his wife, he must do so with a document. There's no mitzvah to divorce, but if you want to divorce, you have to do it a certain way. The achas mitzvahs lo saseh, and the second commandment is a negative commandment. V'hi shelo yachazir gerushasei mishanises. The mitzvah is that if you divorce your wife and she gets married to somebody else, you can no longer ever remarry her. The explanation of these two mitzvahs is coming in the following 13 chapters, Be'ezrat Hashem. Just forgive the noise a little bit. They're making a Hanukkah event downstairs. Perek Rishon, the Rambam begins chapter 1. The Rambam is super organized, and he begins by giving us the 10 basic rules that apply to divorce. A woman can only get a divorce with a written document that reaches her. Get. This written document is called a get. Get is the Hebrew word in general for document, but specifically it refers to divorce. The Vilna Gaon once said, why is it called a get? Because in the entire Torah, Gimel and Tet are never next to each other. So they represent separation. Every other letter is connected to every other letter. Gimel and Tet you never find anywhere connected. So it represents divorce. There are 10 things that are the principle, the core of divorce biblically. And you're going to see, this is the verse on the screen here, is the verse where it describes divorce. It says, Ki yikach ish isha u'be'ala, if somebody marries a woman, and then she doesn't find favor in his eyes because he finds some problem, v'kasav la sefer Christos v'nastan b'yada, he writes her a document of cutting off, and he puts it into her hand, v'shilcha mi beisai, and sends her out of the house. And the Rambam is going to show how in every word of this verse is hinted another condition. But first, let's learn the conditions. Ve'elu hein, they are the following, followed from left to right on this chart. Aleph, shelo yegaresh ha'ish ela birtzaynai. A man can only divorce with his will. He has to want the divorce. You can't force a divorce upon him. Beis, v'sheyegaresh biksav alei b'davar acher. It has to be a written document right here. Nothing else can divorce. Only a written document. Gimel, v'sheyeh inyan haksav shegersha v'hasira mikinyanai. The topic of the written document has to be that the husband divorces the wife and he removes her. The Rambam will soon show you how this works. He has to say, you go away. If he says, I'm going away, that's not a good divorce. He has to remove her from his acquisition. The topic of the written document has to completely cut him off from her. We'll soon see what that means. You can't tell your wife, I'm divorcing you today, but you can't do something in 30 days. If you're keeping those conditions, you're still keeping hold of her for 30 days. It has to be a total chop off. It has to be written for the sake of your wife. You have to have her in mind. It should be lacking no action after you write it, only giving it to her. Which means, for example, you cannot write a get on a leaf. Because if you write it on a leaf, then you have to first pull it off the tree and then give it to her. Biblically, it has to only be lacking the giving, not any other stages. Zayin v'sheyitnei it has to be given to her. It has to reach her possession, either her hand or her courtyard, has to come to her. Ches v'sheyitnei b'fnei eidin, you have to give it in the presence of witnesses. 2 guys have to be watching the handover of the divorce. Tes v'sheyitnei b'toras Geirushin, you have to give her the document as a divorce. She cannot be thinking, look here, I'm getting a Torah scroll or some money back. She has to be getting an actual divorce. She has to know she's getting a divorce. And Yud v'sheyiyah habal shluchai hu shenoisnei lo, it has to be the husband or his agent giving it to her. She can't be taking it from the floor. He has to give it to her. Ush'ara dvarim shebeget, anything else, any other laws in a divorce document, kigen hazman v'chasim asa edim v'chayetze behen, like putting in the date or the fact that witnesses have to sign, and we'll explore all these later. Hakom medivrei seifrim, everything is only rabbinic. These are the 10 biblical elements of a divorce. Halacha beis, uminayin sha'asara dvarim elu min haTorah. How do we know that these 10 things are all biblical? Shenemar, because it says, v'hoya im leisimtza chen be'einav, this is the verse before. It will be, if she doesn't find favor in his eyes, he writes her a divorce document, puts it in her hand, sends it away from the house. Every word here is exact. The Rambam begins, if she will not find favor in his eyes, that means it has to be willingly. Maimonides teaches us, you only divorce with your will. You have to have decided that you don't want your wife anymore. Nobody else can say that for you. If a woman gets divorced without a husband's will, she's not even considered divorced. A woman, we don't ask her opinion. Husband can divorce her whether she wants to or not. The husband gets to initiate, not the wife. By the way, today there is a cherem de Rabbi Geirushin which says that you cannot divorce your wife unwillingly. If she doesn't want, you cannot divorce her. If she does want and you don't want, that's where the tragic issues begin. And today we have whole movements to protect the women in these cases. Gimel, bekasav. It says you have to write. Writing means she only gets divorced with a written document. It has to be an actual document. La, you have to write it to her, which means lishma, for her, with intent for her. Sefer Christos, it has to be a document of cutting off, which means davar hakodesh beinay lebeina. It has to completely cut him off from her. No authority remains. He has no authority over her after the divorce. If it doesn't completely cut them off, she's not divorced, as will be explained. And I gave you an example already of that before, but we're going to see many more examples about that. You cannot hold any authority on your wife after you divorce her. The nasan biyada, you have to put it into her hand. The Rambam continues, first of all, you have to give it to her. That's the nasan, you give it to her. It has to come to her hand, or at least to the hand of her agent, which is like her hand, or to her courtyard. It's all considered to be like her hand, as will be explained. But it has to reach her. The shilcha, you have to send her away. Which means the topic of the divorce has to imply that you are the one sending her away, not sending yourself away from her. Dalid, Ketzah, what does that look like? Kasavla, if he writes in the divorce, Hareat mishulachas, you are sent away. Hareat migureshes, you are divorced. Hareat latzmich, you are on your own. Hareat muteres l'chol adam, you can marry anybody. V'chayetze bezeha inyan, or anything like that. Harezu migureshes, she is divorced. In fact, the gufay shall get, the main body, there's a whole document that we write, but the main line in the get is, Hareat muteres l'chol adam, you are allowed to go marry anybody, you're free to go. Avalim kasavla, but if the husband writes to her, Eini ba'lech, I'm no longer your husband. Eini aruseich, I'm no longer your betrothed. Eini isheich, I'm no longer your man. Ein zaget, that's not a divorce. Shenemar, because it says, Vishilcha, you have to send her away. Loisha yeshalach asatzma, not where you send yourself away. Similarly, if you write to a woman, Hareat bas choyrin, you are free. Ein get, that's not a good divorce language. Because that's used for slaves, not for wives. Halacha hey. The fact that it says in the Torah, you send her away from the home, it does not mean it doesn't mean that the divorce is only finalized when she leaves your house. The wording your house isn't literal. The moment her hand gets the divorce is finished. Even if she's still in your house. As will be explained. The only reason Torah says you send her away is it means if you divorce and you didn't send her away from home, that's like divorcing and remarrying your divorcee. Therefore, if you kept your wife at home for too long after the divorce, you may need a new divorce because there's room to think that you may have had relations with her again.
Or marry a new marriage.
Yes, or do a new marriage. But the point is, you do have to send her out of the house after you send her away. But the house leaving isn't what makes the divorce. How do we know the other condition that it cannot be lacking any action? After the writing, you just write it and then you give it. Shenemar, because it says, v'kosav v'nosan. You write and then you give, which means, misha ene mechusar ala ksiva unesina hu haget hakosher. A kosher divorce is only one that is only lacking writing and giving. Yotza, that excludes davar shemechusar ktzitza achar haksiva, something which would require to be cut off after you write it. For example, lefichach, therefore, im kasav get al keren hapara. If you write a divorce on the horn of a cow, noisam lahapara, you must give her the cow. You cannot cut off the horn and then give her the horn, because that wouldn't be the kasav v'nasan. You have to write it and then give it right away. If you cut the horn after you wrote it, and you gave it to her, that's no longer a divorce. Similarly, if you wrote a document attached to the ground, even if the witnesses only signed it, after you detached it, and you gave it to her, that isn't a divorce because you have to write it and right away give it. You cannot write attached to the ground even what's called the toifes. We're going to explore this later in these laws. Every divorce document has a tofes. Tofes means the main body of the text, the generic text, and every get has a toref. Toref means the specific customized text. The toref is the name of the man, the name of the woman, and the date. Those are unique to every divorce. Tofes is like the generic text that always says the same. So the Rambam says you can't even write the generic parts of the get on a leaf attached to the ground. Kasav hatoifes b'mechubar v'tolshe. What if you did? You wrote the generic part of the document while it was attached to the ground. V'tolshe, and then you picked it. V'achar kach kasav shema ish v'shema isha v'hazman. And then you wrote the name of the man, the name of the woman, and the date. The hariyat teres l'chol adam, and the final line of you are allowed to marry anybody. That's also part of the Torah. V'chasama, and then you signed it. Unesanela, and you gave it to her kosher, then it's kosher. Ideally, you shouldn't do it. But if you wrote the generic part while it was attached to the ground, as long as you wrote the main parts, man, woman, date, and the main line, after detachment, you're good. If you wrote the entire divorce on a leaf that was planted in a flower pot that had a hole. So it's in a flower pot, but it has a hole which makes it attached to the ground. Even if you gave away the entire flower pot, haget pasul, the divorce is disqualified, because you might cut off the leaf and then it will be detached, and that will disqualify it on the basis of the kasa v'nasa. What you could do is write it on the pottery of the flower pot, the actual pot. There's no issue of detaching. So you can write the divorce on the actual flower pot and give it to her. How do we know that you have to give it to her as a divorce? She cannot think that she's getting it as a scroll or as some money. Because it says, Sefer Krisos v'nasan biyada. A bill of divorce you must put into her hand. That means Sheyite Noisei b'Torah Sefer Krisos, you have to give it to her as a divorce. But if you gave it to her thinking, she thought that it's a IOU, a promissory note, or a mezuzah, or you gave it to her while she was sleeping, and she wakes up and it's in her hand, she didn't receive it as a divorce, that isn't a divorce. Only if you told her afterwards, that was your divorce, then it is a divorce. As long as she holds it at a certain point, knowing that it's a bill of divorce. Halacha Yud. Amar le'edim, if you told witnesses, here, watch this divorce document, I'm giving it to the woman. The chazar v'amar, then you tell the actual woman, you tell her, kinsi shtar chayiv zeh, here, take this owing document, take this IOU note. You told the witnesses it's a divorce, you tell the woman it's a chov, it's a debt. Harei zeh kosher, it's kosher. Sharei haidia esa edim shenasne b'teiras Geirushin, because you told the witnesses that it's a divorce. The fact that you told the woman that it's only a debt, because you were embarrassed, you were ashamed. In the moment you got ashamed, but you were actually meant to give it as a divorce. Yud Aleph, Hamegarish, a person who is divorcing, you must tell the woman, as you give her the divorce, you must tell her, this is your divorce, or it is your divorce, or anything like it. If you just put it into her hand, you didn't say anything, get puzzle. It's a disqualified divorce. When do we say that? If you weren't discussing before the divorce. But if you were talking about the divorce, and you simply put the divorce into her hand, and you didn't say a word, get kosher, it's kosher, because the context before tells you that we were talking about divorce. Yud Beis. If there was a divorce document on the ground, and you told her, lady, pick up your divorce from the ground. And she took it. Or it was tied to his hand or to his thigh, and she pulled it out. Even if he says afterwards, that's your divorce, it isn't a divorce. Because it says he has to put it into her hand. That's all the way on the right. Not that she takes it on her own. Neither he nor his agent gave it to her. But if he bent his body over or bent his hand over, till she took the divorce from him, and then he told her, it's your divorce, that's a good divorce, because at least he did some kind of action to show that he's initiating the divorce. How do we know you must give it to her in front of witnesses? This doesn't say by the divorce verse, but it says elsewhere, everything in Jewish law is established on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's Marriage is no less than that. It's impossible that a woman should be one day forbidden to everybody. If you have relations with her, you get killed, and then the next day she's allowed with no witnesses. There has to be witnesses. Therefore, if you give her a divorce privately between you and her, even if there's only one witness, it isn't a divorce at all. It has to be watched by two witnesses. When do we say that? If the divorce document was written by somebody else, by a scribe. But if the husband himself was a scribe, and he writes the divorce in his own handwriting, and he has a witness sign, one witness, and he gives it to her, it's a disqualified get. Disqualified means only rabbinically, it's less level, and she is actually not allowed to marry a Kohen. In that way, it's considered to be somewhat like a get, because you say the husband, his handwriting, together with the witness, is like two witnesses. So it's got some power. Disqualified rabbinically, but it's got some power. Versus the last case where we said, no get klal, it isn't a get at all, that's a biblical disqualification. Halacha tesvav, takanas chachamim hi sheyu ha'edim chesmen ala get. The sages enacted that besides for witnesses watching the handover of the divorce, they should also sign the document. Shema yitim la get b'fnei shnayim v'yamusu. Why? Why did the sages say this? Because you might give the get in front of two witnesses, they'll die, v'nimtza haget shebeyada kecheres mechar se'adama, and the get in her hand will be worthless. She can never prove it. The two witnesses died. Because there are no witnesses signed on the document. And therefore, the sages enacted that the witnesses should testify inside the document itself and sign it. But that doesn't take away the obligation to have witnesses watching it. Even if his witness is signing it, you must give it to her in front of two witnesses. Whether it's the same two witnesses who signed it or two other witnesses, doesn't matter. Because the main divorce happens when witnesses are watching as you hand it over, not Eidei Chasima, the witnesses who are signing it. If two witnesses signed the divorce, and you transgressed, you didn't have two witnesses watching it, you simply gave it to her privately. Or you gave it in front of witnesses, but it was discovered that the witnesses who were watching were not allowed to be witnesses. They weren't kosher witnesses. They had some bad record or whatever it is, or their relatives. Kosher, it's still kosher. Since the witnesses inside the document are kosher, and she's holding the divorce, it's okay. Some Geonim say that it's disqualified, but the Rambam says he thinks it's kosher. Yud Zayin, if the witnesses who signed it were disqualified, even if one was kosher and one was disqualified, and you gave it in front of two witnesses who were actually kosher, it's still disqualified. Why? Even though you followed biblical law, but when you look at the document, it's called shenimtza kimizuyaf mitocha. It's falsified inside it. It's signed by non-kosher witnesses. So even if the guys who watched it were kosher, it's a problem. I should bring together one day an actual divorce document so you can see what it looks like. But you write it like a Torah scroll, like a mezuzah. If you leave 2 lines of space between the writing and the witnesses, puzzle, it's disqualified because we're worried that somebody can write in some false information in between. How far should the witnesses sign from the document? Less than 2 lines of space, so you can read the witnesses with the document. When do we say this law? If the only source for the divorce is her hands, she has the divorce, and there's nobody who watched the handover. But if you handed it over with witnesses, even if the text signed witnesses are very far from the text, and you cannot read the document with the witnesses, or even if there are no witnesses at all that are signed on it, it's again kosher biblically, because the fundamental divorce takes place when witnesses are watching you hand it over. You test. The witnesses who are watching the divorce being handed over, they must first read it and then you hand it over to her. They have to know what they're testifying about. Both witnesses, yeah. Read it. Yeah. If you only handed it over to the woman first as they watched, and they didn't read it first, they can read it later. But they have to read it at some point after you give it to her. If they read it while the divorce was being held by the husband or by his agent, and they gave it back to him, And then he puts it back into his bosom or something. And only then gives it to her. They have to read it again. We don't know, maybe he's hiding something in his pocket, who knows? They got to watch it from the moment that they're reading it till it goes to the woman. In the above case, if they didn't reread it, he gave it to them, they read it, he puts it into his bosom, takes it out again. It might be a new document, it might be the same one. They didn't read it, they didn't reread it. And she takes the divorce, throws it into the fire or into the sea. No way to know. She is divorced. Since they read it the first time, we don't worry that he changed it. Not only that, even if the husband later clearly says, I was a magician. It was a different document, it wasn't a divorce that you read. He's not believed. They read it once, we believe that. And she is divorced. What if they never read it once? They never even read it. And then he gives the divorce while they're watching. And she chucks it into the fire or into the sea. Here the opposite is true. Even if the husband says it was actually a divorce, she's only divorced out of doubt. Because the witnesses didn't read it, maybe it wasn't a divorce.
Is there a ramification of it?
You have to do it again, but she cannot marry a Kohen. If you threw the divorce into her courtyard, among a bunch of barrels, as witnesses watched, ubikshu, they searched the barrels, umatzu mezuzah ishtar and they find a mezuzah or a different document. Ein cheshesh we don't even worry about the divorce. Shezeh nimtza hu shezarak, for sure what he threw, that's what they found, and it wasn't the divorce. Nimtzu sham shtayim shalish mezuzahs ishtares, but if 2-3 documents or mezuzahs were found, now we have to worry. Chesheshin shema get shezarak graru achbarim, maybe he did throw an actual divorce. Mice dragged it away. V'harezu safek migureshes, and she's therefore divorced out of doubt. Witnesses who sign on a divorce have to be literate. They have to know how to read and how to sign their names. If they don't know how to read, read it to them, and they'll sign it. They have to know the language that the document is written in. If they don't know how to sign, and we can trace their names with spit or anything which won't last. And they can trace it over the tracing and then sign their actual names. We don't do this license for other documents, only for divorces. The sages were lenient when it came to divorce, not to leave Jewish women in limbo. Since the whole idea of witnesses signing is rabbinic, as we explained, the rabbis were lenient. They said, you know what? You can sign even over a trace mark. Even though it's only rabbinic that witnesses should sign, the sages enacted that the witnesses should clearly write their names in the divorce. The witnesses that can only sign in the presence of each other. If they weren't watching each other, it's disqualified divorce. The sages also enacted you must write the date and the place where you wrote the divorce document like any other document. Why? Because you might protect your wife. Maybe your wife will be your relative, she'll be your niece, let's say. And she'll do adultery while she was married to you. And you, wanting to protect her, will write a divorce after the adultery with no date and give it to her. If there won't be a date on it, she can say, I got divorced before the adultery. Therefore they said, put in a date into the divorce, and that way we always know when the divorce was actually written. If there's a witness, if there's a divorce document that has witnesses signed but no date, or it was predated or post-dated, or it was written by day and signed the next night. And even if they were busy with the divorce all day, or you miswrote the city. You wrote it in Jerusalem and you by mistake wrote in Lud. These are all disqualified. The witnesses have to sign on the time of the writing and in the locale of the writing. There cannot be any mistakes there. You wrote the date, then you cut it off and you gave her the divorce. Where you didn't write the actual full date. You wrote the first week of Kislev, or the second week of Tevet. You didn't write which day. Or you just wrote the month. not the week, or just the year, and not the month. Afilu kasav b'shavua plaini, even if you write in this cycle of 7 years, this Shemitah, kosher, it's still kosher because you have some kind of date. Also, if you write, I divorced her today, kosher, it's kosher. Because the word today means this day, which you see the divorce. For peace with the government, we also count the years of the local government. It's year number 3 to King Charles, to keep the peace. If you wrote the year based on a governance or a kingship that was not the local kingship, a different kingship. Let's say you're in America, you write, it's year 3 of Charles in England. Or you use the temple years, the year since temple was built. Or the temple destruction. If it was the local custom to use that count, kosher, it's kosher. If nobody uses that count, it's disqualified. All Jews already have a custom, limnes bagitin, in divorce documents to use the count, either to creation, or the kingship of Alexander the Great, which is called the count of the documents. If you used the governance-ship in a locale where that governance has authority, even if they don't live there, it's kosher. If someone tells 2 people, write and sign and give a document to my wife, and they delayed days or years. They wrote the divorce, but it was a disqualified divorce. They had to rewrite a divorce, a kosher divorce, after many years. Kameshi Yisbaraz will be explained how to go about that. They have to write the new date, the date of when they're writing it, and the place of when they're writing it. Not the time or place where they were commanded to write the divorce. Keita, what does that look like? If they were in Jerusalem when he commanded them, and it was the month of Tishrei, and it was delayed till Nisan, and they're now in Lud. On the document it's going to say Nisan and Lud, where that's where the divorce was written, Kishar Shacharis, like any other document. And that concludes the general outline. Tomorrow we're going to get very, very specific in the laws of divorce.